Now, in this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about our brains. Now, call me crazy, but I do think that given our brain and nervous system is pretty much responsible for how we experience life, it's helpful to understand a little bit about how it works. And one of my biggest frustrations, honestly, with the medical field, the psychology field, is that we know so much more now about the brain and neuroplasticity. Yet this information is not filtering down into public services. So just a little explanation about neuroplasticity. I'm sure you've heard the word before. So neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to change itself in response to what it experiences, both externally and internally. Now, our schemas are a result of the neuroplastic process happening in childhood. Our brain, our developing brain, is adapting to the experiences it's having. So, sometimes we think, might think, oh my God, I've got all these schemas, I'm damaged. You're not. Actually, the majority of what we experience, even if it's not wanted, even if it's unpleasant, is usually the result of a brain doing exactly what it has evolved to do, given the experience that it's having. So often schemas are a normal response to abnormal circumstances in childhood. Anyway, I'm getting off the point a little bit here. But the point I'm trying to make is a lot of I think about some of the top issues that, people struggle with these days, which is like anxiety, depression, procrastination, ADHD, also anger issues, low self-esteem. These are primarily a result of the brain adapting to its experience. And just as, neuroplasticity is neither good nor bad, it just is. And it can go one way or the other. It can move in favor of us, or it can move in directions that do not serve us. For example, anxiety. I'll explain in a minute how anxiety can develop. But anxiety is often an appropriate response by the brain to what input it is receiving. So anyway, I just think it's really important because once you understand a little bit about the brain, how the brain works, it can just release all that self-criticism and feeling that there's something wrong with us and hopelessness that we're never going to be able to change. And again, one of my bugbears with the medical profession is the labeling of everybody and everything. Everyone's got this or that or the other, and quite often, and then with these labels comes kind of like a finality that, this is it. This is me for life. This is what I've got. I've got this disorder. When actually it's something happening in the brain that can actually be changed. So that being said, I'm going to talk about two structures today, the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. And I'll just talk a little bit actually first about brain development. So in evolution terms, so our brain was built from the bottom up. As we evolved, our brains became more and more complex until we kind of became Homo sapiens, I think a couple of 100,000 years ago. And our current brain is in the same form as it has been for the last 70,000 years. And it built from the kind of bottom up. So you've got the so-called reptile brain, which is kind of lower brain stem and stuff. Then you've got the emotional brain or the limbic system. The emotional brain is where, it's basically subconscious. It's where all our schemas live. It's where our emotions get generated. It's where our desires live. And then you've got what's called the neocortex, which is a distinctly, all mammals have a neocortex, but ours is more highly developed as humans. And a part of the brain that I'm going to talk about today is part of this, distinctly human brain. It's called the prefrontal cortex, and it's just behind your forehead. And it's primarily responsible for all our uniquely human qualities. So, for example, it's responsible for emotional regulation, which is the ability to calm down our emotional state and bring ourselves back to a place of calm and balance. Also to bring us up from lethargy, from depressive states, from low mood, from apathy. So the prefrontal cortex has the ability to regulate our internal emotional state. It also has the ability, its functions are concentration, planning, execution of plans, long-term planning, strategy, attention to detail, these very kind of human qualities. Also responsible for empathy, self-reflection, self-awareness, insight. So the prefrontal cortex is our logical, rational brain, and it's our conscious brain. And you have to understand that 90% thereabouts of our brain is subconscious, operates under consciousness, subconsciously. Our prefrontal cortex is our conscious brain. Now, the other structure I'm going to talk about resides in the emotional brain, the limbic system, which is far older than the prefrontal cortex. It's very powerful. And the part of the brain, the amygdala, that lives in this emotional brain is very much responsible for a lot of our emotional issues. Now, the amygdala is basically a radar or an alarm, and its primary job is to keep us alive. It's all about survival. That's all it cares about. So it will push us towards things that it thinks are good for our survival, and it will pull us away, push us away from things that it believes are dangerous. It's often called the fear radar, but it's more than that. It also moves towards things that it thinks are good for us. Now, the amygdala is a tiny little almond structure. We've got two, and it's about the size of a thumbnail, kind of behind each ear, sort of. But anyway, just think of it as there. And the amygdala has connections to so many different parts of our body and brain. Now, the amygdala is connected to all our senses. This is how it's constantly scanning, our senses, our eyes, our sight, our sense of smell, our hearing, touch. So it's always looking for something that's dangerous. It's also connected to our thoughts and our internal systems. And what the amygdala does, if it perceives any kind of danger, now that can be physical danger, it can also be emotional danger, but you've got to remember, that our amygdala still thinks we live in tribes, and the way to survive was to stay in the tribe. So if the amygdala perceives that we're being rejected or disapproved of, or someone doesn't like us, it sets off the alarm. Now, the alarm is the stress response, and the stress response is the fight or flight or freeze. So the stress response, basically, you'll all know this, you've all experienced fear or anxiety. Adrenaline starts coursing through your body. It gives you energy, become very tense. Your thoughts become hyper-focused on the threat. Blood, moves towards your extremities. Certain systems shut down temporarily, like the digestive system. It's basically getting ready to fight or run or go into a freeze response. So that's the amygdala. It sets off this stress system. Now, our amygdala and prefrontal cortex are supposed to kind of work together. It's kind of called the wise mind, where the amygdala will activate the alarm if it perceives something, and the prefrontal cortex can then come in, microseconds, milliseconds later, and assess whether or not the amygdala has got the right idea of, whether we're in danger. An example of this would be you're walking through a forest, going about, looking around, and then your amygdala catches sight of something that it believes to be a snake. It's got a very fuzzy vision. It's just like an approximation. It's like, okay, it's got a lot of data banks, actually, of information. The amygdala goes through life recording emotional experiences and data. And so you're going along the woods, and the amygdala catches sight of a snake. And it sees this long thing in the grass, and it immediately activates the stress response. So we might just suddenly jump back, and then the prefrontal cortex comes in and has a look and goes, okay, long, inanimate object, no head, brown, it's a stick. And it tells the amygdala to calm down. So this is how they're supposed to work. The amygdala can set off the alarm. The prefrontal cortex then comes in, assesses, calms it down. But, life often doesn't turn out that way. Now, what's important to understand is these brain structures, the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, develop, obviously in childhood, but they are very much influenced by our childhood environment. So, for example, the amygdala, if we are raised in a family where there's a lot of tension, stress, like from criticism, from abuse, from neglect, from, parents withdrawing love, ignoring us or hitting us. If we are growing up in an environment where we're always on edge, we're always like waiting, like, oh, God, have I done something wrong? Are they upset with me? Am I going to be criticized? Whatever. Or parents are fighting and we're constantly worrying they're going to split up, or, that level of tension, it's prolonged stress. The amygdala becomes robust. It becomes overdeveloped. It becomes what we call hypervigilant, starts to see danger everywhere. It's constantly on edge. Now, this can obviously happen in childhood, but the amygdala comes online in the third trimester of pregnancy. So if the mother is going through stress and there's a lot of stress hormones in her system, the amygdala detects that and it readies itself. It's like basically saying, oh my God, we're going to be born into a really dangerous environment. We need to be prepared. We need to, keep a lookout. So children can be born anxious, and it's not a personality trait. It's neuroplasticity. The amygdala is adapting to the environment that it finds itself in and doing what it should be doing. It's becoming more aware and more robust in order to protect us. So we can end up as teenagers, as adults, with a very anxious nature. And then when the stress response is activated, our perception changes, is part of the survival response. And we become very narrow focused. And the prefrontal cortex in times of high stress goes offline. So the amygdala is just running the show. There's no checks and balances there because the prefrontal cortex is knocked offline by high stress and emotional activation. So going back to childhood as well, the prefrontal cortex develops pretty much after 2 to 3 years old, around about that time, starts to develop, isn't fully developed until we're in our 20s. So it's very plastic. The prefrontal cortex, with all its functions that I was talking about, is what we call use dependent, which means it needs to be used in order to develop. It's dependent on use to be maintained. So if you think about the skill of one of the prefrontal cortex skills, which is curbing impulsivity. Impulsivity, that I want, is very much the emotional brain. The emotional brain doesn't care. It wants something, it goes for it. It doesn't care about the consequences. And then, so as children, when we're 2-3 years old, we just want anything. It's no boundaries at all. We're just like, God, this, I want that. And we are taught to delay gratification, to wait for things. And this develops the prefrontal cortex ability to override the amygdala's impulsivity. to be able to tolerate uncomfortable feelings without acting on them. That's one of the prefrontal cortex skills. Also concentration, focus, and planning. These need to be cultivated in childhood in order for them to exist as adults. And same with emotional regulation. Now, if we have a secure, good enough childhood with our emotional needs met, our needs to play, to experiment, to be creative, to explore, if we have good boundaries, if we have a secure environment with caregivers who are attending to our needs, who are attuned to us. And this doesn't mean that they're hovering around us, giving us everything we want. It's not about that. It's a good enough childhood where we feel safe. Not to say that certain things don't happen, but we feel cared for and supported by our caregivers. If we have that, the prefrontal cortex tends to develop all its functions well. But if we don't, we can end up with emotional regulation problems as adults. We can end up with lack of empathy. We can end up with an inability to tolerate discomfort. So we can't delay gratification, which means we can't achieve long-term goals. And in a way, ADHD, I believe, is a result of this, because the prefrontal cortex is very susceptible to many things, to scrolling. If you scroll or go on the internet and all this information, it actually depletes the prefrontal cortex. It has to regenerate through good sleep. If we're constantly stressed or overwhelmed or anxious, then the prefrontal cortex is kind of offline and compromised. So it's a bit of a kind of catch-22. The more emotional difficulties we struggle with, the less capable the prefrontal cortex is of managing those emotions. So anyway, the point is that a lot of our issues today are because our emotional brain is too active, is too activated. Our amygdala is oversensitive, it's too robust, and our prefrontal cortex is compromised, depleted, or underdeveloped, so that we're not able to kind of manage the emotional brain. But the good news is, all of this happens because of neuroplasticity, and the way out is through neuroplasticity. Our amygdala can be retrained to become less sensitive, to become less alert. We can build up our prefrontal cortex and all its functions. We can kind of deactivate the emotional intensity in our emotional brain. So I hope that was helpful. And subscribe if you want to see more of these videos. And if you have any questions at all, please put them in the comments below.